Imagine you are standing at like 17,000 feet above sea level.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. The air is so thin that every single breath feels like trying to inhale through a crushed straw.
That sounds miserable.
It is. And it's October of 1957. You're part of an Indian Army patrol, and you're moving slowly through one of the most desolate, unforgiving landscapes on the entire planet.
Aksai Chin?
Exactly, Aksai Chin. The temperature is plunging toward minus 30 degrees Celsius. And, you are out here because you're patrolling the far edges of what your maps tell you is sovereign Indian territory.
Right, which is supposed to be totally empty.
It's supposed to be. Nothing but ancient, dried-up salt lakes and freezing winds. But then you crest a ridge and you look down and you see something that just makes your blood run absolutely cold. And I mean, it's not the weather.
It's the realization that the map you're holding in your freezing hands is, well, it's a complete and utter fiction.
Yeah, because down below, cutting straight through the permafrost, is a massive, engineered, heavily compacted dirt and gravel highway.
Wide enough for heavy military trucks.
With fresh tire tracks. There's evidence of massive construction camps. And this road wasn't built by the Indian government.
No, it was not.
It was built entirely in secret over the course of several years by the People's Republic of China.
And that single moment of discovery, that sudden, shocking visual proof of a monumental geopolitical deception, is really the spark that eventually ignites one of the most misunderstood conflicts of the 20th century.
And consequential. Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we are taking all the historical sources, the military analyses, the declassified intelligence surrounding the Sino-Indian War of 1962, and we are breaking it down to its absolute bedrock.
Right, because for India, the events of October 1962, they weren't just a border skirmish.
No, not at all.
They were a profound, nation-altering strategic shock. I mean, it completely rewrote their foreign policy, their military posture, and really their understanding of their place in Asia.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because while the soldiers on the ground during this conflict exhibited just unimaginable, desperate bravery under horrific conditions, and they did, our focus today really requires us to zoom out.
Yeah, we have to look at the architecture of a systemic failure here.
Right. And for you, listening, we are operating on a very specific thematic premise today, which is battles are lost long before the first shot is fired, when strategy, intelligence, and preparation completely collapse.
Battles lost before they begin. That's the anchor for our entire conversation today.
We're exploring how two historically peaceful neighbors nations that had literally coexisted for millennia without a major war ended up in this brutal, high-altitude slaughter.
And to understand that, we can't just look at the battlefields. We have to look at the deep history, the impossible geography, and a slow-motion political train wreck.
Yeah. So let's rewind the clock. Because before we can even talk about a border war, we have to talk about the fact that for most of human history, India and China didn't even really share a border.
Right. That is the crucial starting point. For over 2,000 years, the relationship between the Indian subcontinent and the Chinese Empire was defined by the massive geographical reality of Tibet.
Right.
Tibet wasn't just a neighbor, it was a gigantic, frozen, impenetrable buffer state.
Okay, let's unpack that term for a second because we hear it a lot in geopolitics, right?
Yeah.
A buffer state. It sounds like, bubble wrap between two fragile items. What does it actually mean in the context of empires?
Well, a buffer state is essentially a neutral, usually weaker country that sits squarely between two larger, potentially hostile and expanding powers.
Okay.
Its entire geopolitical function is physical separation. It prevents the militaries of the two major powers from ever coming into direct contact.
So you don't accidentally start a war over a border misunderstanding.
Exactly. As long as the buffer state remains neutral and autonomous, the two massive empires don't have to constantly worry about a sudden invasion from that direction. They don't have to build massive defensive forts. They don't have to keep hundreds of thousands of troops on high alert.
So for the British Empire in India and the Qing dynasty in China, Tibet was like the ultimate geopolitical shock absorber.
Precisely. And during the era of British India, maintaining that shock absorber was the absolute cornerstone of their northern imperial strategy.
Because of Russia.
Yes.
Yeah.
The British were playing what was known as the Great Game. It was this decades-long shadow war of espionage and diplomacy with the Russian Empire.
Right. The British were terrified that Russian influence would just creep south through Central Asia, enter Tibet, and suddenly the Russians would be looking down from the Himalayas directly into the wealthy plains of British India.
So the British didn't just passively hope Tibet stayed neutral, they actively engineered it.
And this brings us to 1904. and a man named Lord Curzon.
The British Viceroy of India.
Yeah. He gets so paranoid about Russian spies in Lhasa, which is the Tibetan capital, that he decides to force the issue.
He organizes a military expedition. It's led by a British officer named Colonel Francis Younghusband.
Younghusband, right?
And they march a heavily armed British Indian force straight up into the freezing altitudes of Tibet, unfortunately massacring poorly armed Tibetan defenders along the way. And they push all the way into Lhasa.
The Dalai Lama actually has to flee to Mongolia, doesn't he?
He does. And the whole point of this brutal expedition wasn't to conquer Tibet and make it part of India.
Right. It was to force Tibet to sign a treaty guaranteeing that no other foreign power, meaning Russia, would be allowed any influence there.
Exactly. The British secured trading rights. They set up little military garrisons in places like Giants just to keep watch. And then they essentially went back down the mountain.
They turned Tibet into a British protectorate in all but name.
Right. Now, what's fascinating is how the British handled China in all of this. Because the British were perfectly happy to publicly recognize that China had a sort of vague historical authority over Tibet.
They called it suzerainty.
Yes, suzerainty.
Okay, let's pause and define that. Because suzerainty versus sovereignty is basically the legal friction point for this entire war, isn't it?
It is the absolute crux of the legal argument. So sovereignty means absolute, unquestioned control over a territory. You make the laws, you control the borders, you command the army.
You own it.
You own it. Suzerainty is much more nebulous. It means a powerful nation has a historical tributary relationship with a weaker nation.
Okay.
The weaker nation manages its own day-to-day internal affairs, but the powerful nation claims ultimate overlordship, especially regarding foreign policy.
So the British loved the concept of Chinese suzerainty over Tibet because the Chinese empire at the time was weak and decaying.
Exactly. As long as China was weak, acknowledging their suzerainty was a polite legal fiction.
Yeah.
It kept other European powers out while allowing Tibet to function as a fully independent buffer state for India.
It was a perfect, delicate geopolitical balancing act. And when India finally gains its independence in 1947, the new Indian government, led by Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, looks at this setup and says, great, we are inheriting this.
Right.
We will be the successors to the British treaties. Tibet remains our autonomous buffer.
But, geopolitical tectonic plates never stay still. The balancing act completely shatters just 2 years later.
1949.
October 1st, 1949. The devastating Chinese Civil War finally ends. Mao Zedong stands in Tiananmen Square and proclaims the establishment of the People's Republic of China.
And suddenly you have a unified, centralized, battle-hardened communist government in Beijing.
And they are not interested in polite legal fictions. They look at the map of the old Qing dynasty and they want it all back.
Which means acting on their historical claims. I mean, in 1950, China annexes the vast northwestern region of Xinjiang. But the move that fundamentally changes Indian history happens on October 7th, 1950.
Yes.
The Chinese People's Liberation Army, the PLA, crosses the Yangtze River and invades Tibet.
They called it the peaceful liberation of Tibet, but it was a military conquest. The Tibetan army, which was small and totally antiquarian, tries to stop them at a place called Shamdo.
And they get crushed.
The PLA completely decimates them. And within weeks, the historical buffer state that had protected the Indian subcontinent for thousands of years just ceases to exist.
I want to really emphasize the panic this caused in New Delhi, because Prime Minister Nehru issues these furious diplomatic protests deploring the invasion. But the sources show us what was actually happening behind closed doors.
Right.
There was a highly classified, urgent meeting held by the Indian government to discuss if they could physically intervene to save Tibet.
And the key figure in that meeting was the commander-in-chief of the Indian Army, General K.M. Cariappa. He's asked by the political leadership to provide a military assessment of the situation.
And Cariappa does not sugarcoat it. He tells them it is impossible.
Absolutely impossible.
India had just fought a war with Pakistan over Kashmir in 1947 and 1948. The Indian Army was stretched incredibly thin.
Furthermore, he points out that fighting the PLA is not like fighting a ragtag militia. The Chinese troops had just spent 20 years fighting a brutal civil war and a war against the Japanese Empire. They were arguably the most experienced light infantry in the world at that moment.
And armed with immense amounts of captured American and Japanese weaponry.
Exactly. And the contrast with the Indian Army was stark. General Cariappa explicitly warned the politicians that the Indian Army was trained and equipped for fighting in the hot plains and jungles.
Right.
They possessed virtually no cold weather gear. no specialized high-altitude equipment. He told them, point blank, that an Indian battalion might be able to march up into the Chumbi Valley, but if they tried to fight the PLA in the deep mountains of Tibet, they would be slaughtered by the elements before the Chinese even opened fire.
So this is our first massive cause and effect chain for you to note. The event. China forcefully occupies Tibet, destroying the buffer state.
The decision. The Indian government, fully aware that they lack the military capacity to contest this, decides they have to pivot.
Right. If you cannot deter an adversary with military strength, you try to disarm them with diplomacy.
And this leads directly to the policy of appeasement and friendship. India becomes one of the very first non-communist nations to officially recognize the People's Republic of China.
They begin passionately advocating for China to be given a seat at the United Nations.
Yeah, Nehru believes that if India champions a post-colonial Afro-Asian solidarity, China will respect that brotherhood and leave India's borders alone.
And this beautiful, optimistic dream culminates in 1954. India and China sign a major trade and diplomatic agreement. But the centerpiece of this agreement is something called the Panchsheel.
The 5 principles of peaceful coexistence.
Right. And they sound incredible on paper. Mutual respect for each other's territorial integrity and sovereignty, mutual non-aggression, mutual non-interference in each other's internal affairs, equality and mutual benefit, and peaceful coexistence.
It was really the diplomatic high watermark of the 1950s. The phrase Hindi Chini Bhai, meaning Indians and Chinese are brothers, became a massive popular slogan.
But, and this is a massive but, if you look at the actual text of the 1954 agreement, there's a poison pill for India's long-term security.
Yeah.
In order to secure these promises of peace, India officially and legally recognized Tibet as a region of China.
They signed away the buffer state. They completely accepted the new reality.
And the strategic consequence of this was totally asymmetrical. By securing India's public friendship and essentially neutralizing India as a potential threat on their southern flank, China bought themselves incredibly valuable time.
Time to do what? Time to consolidate their military grip on Tibet.
Right.
Tibet is vast, rebellious, and fiercely independent in its culture. To control it, the PLA needed to move massive amounts of troops and supplies, and that required infrastructure.
So while the Indian political establishment was lulled into a false sense of security by the Panchsheel Agreement, convinced that military modernization on the northern border was unnecessary because they had a piece of paper guaranteeing peace,
China was quietly embarking on one of the most ambitious engineering projects of the century.
which brings us back to our opening scene, 1957, the discovery of the Aksai-Chin Road. The cognitive dissonance here is just staggering. You're shaking hands with your neighbor, declaring yourselves brothers, and meanwhile, they're secretly pouring concrete over your backyard.
Exactly.
But let's dig into the how. How does a nation secretly build a highway, what the Chinese call National Highway 219 through territory claimed by another country, without anyone noticing for years?
To understand how they hit it, we have to look closely at the geography of Aksai-Chin. The name itself roughly translates to Desert of White Stones.
Okay.
It is a high-altitude geological anomaly. Imagine an expansive, completely dead, lacustrine desert.
Let me jump in there just to clarify. Lacustrine refers to a landscape formed by ancient lakes that have completely dried up, leaving behind flat basins and salt flats, right?
Exactly. It's a massive, arid plateau sitting at an average altitude of about 17,000 feet. It is enclosed by the Kunlun Mountains to the north and the towering Karakoram Range to the west. Because of the rain shadow effect of the Himalayas, it gets almost no precipitation. It is brutally cold, utterly barren, and supports absolutely no human life.
It's essentially the surface of the moon, just with more ice.
Pretty much. And because it was
Go
so
ahead.
utterly inhospitable, the Indian military didn't maintain permanent outposts there. It was considered a natural barrier.
So they didn't really check on it.
Right. They would send long-range patrols out there maybe once every year or two just to plant a flag and come back. So for China, working in this vast emptiness, secrecy was actually relatively easy.
But why did China need this specific stretch of freezing desert so desperately? I mean, why risk a geopolitical crisis for a salt flat?
Because of logistics. China needed a reliable year-round supply route to sustain its military occupation of Tibet. The routes from eastern China into Tibet were incredibly difficult, crossing multiple deep river gorges. But if they could link their northwestern province of Xinjiang directly to western Tibet, they would have a relatively flat, secure logistical artery, and the only geographically viable route for that highway ran straight through the Aksai-Chin Plateau.
So for China, it wasn't about the intrinsic value of the land at all.
No, it was an existential logistical necessity.
So the Indian Patrol finds the road in 1957. The news trickles back to New Delhi. The illusion of Hindi Chini Bye-Bye begins to crack.
Yeah.
In 1958, India sends specialized patrols to map the exact alignment of this road. One of those Indian patrols is actually apprehended and temporarily detained by Chinese border guards.
And that's when the diplomatic notes start flying back and forth.
The tone of these notes becomes increasingly sharp. India points out that China has built a road on Indian soil. China replies that Aksai Chin has always been Chinese territory, and furthermore, they are deeply offended that armed Indian personnel are intruding into Xinjiang province.
The two nations are suddenly realizing that they have completely contradictory maps.
But the situation is still, contained to angry letters. The real explosion, the spark that turns this from a cartographic dispute into a march toward war, happens because of internal events in China. We have to talk about 1959.
1959 is the pivot point of the century for Asia. Inside China, Chairman Mao Zedong has initiated the Great Leap Forward.
Right.
This was a radical economic and social campaign intended to rapidly transform China from an agrarian economy.
And it was a catastrophic failure of historic proportions.
Absolutely.
The forced collectivization of agriculture led to widespread famine. Millions of Chinese citizens were starving to death.
And because of this unimaginable domestic disaster, Mao's political position within the Chinese Communist Party was suddenly deeply vulnerable. He was facing internal criticism. He needed a unifying issue. He needed to project strength.
And right at that moment of maximum vulnerability for Mao, Tibet explodes.
Right.
March 1959.
The Tibetan people had been chafing under Chinese communist rule for nearly a decade. The suppression of their religion, the forced reforms, the stripping of the Dalai Lama's authority, it all boils over into an armed, desperate uprising in the streets of Lhasa.
The Tibetan resistance actually surrounds the Dalai Lama's summer palace to protect him from being abducted by the PLA, right?
They do. And the Chinese military responds with overwhelming, brutal force. Artillery shells are raining down on Lhasa. And amidst this absolute chaos, on the night of March 17th, 1959, the young Dalai Lama, disguised as a common soldier, slips out of the palace.
He embarks on this harrowing, freezing, 2-week trek across the Himalayas, actively hunted by Chinese troops. He is aiming for the Indian border.
He crosses what is known as the McMahon Line into the Indian territory of the Northeast Frontier Agency.
And on April 3rd, the Indian government, driven by immense public sympathy for the Tibetans, grants the Dalai Lama official political asylum.
To understand the War of 1962, you really have to understand how Beijing reacted to that single decision. For the Chinese leadership, India granting asylum to the Dalai Lama was not a humanitarian act.
No.
It was the ultimate betrayal. It was an explicit violation of the Panchil Agreement's clause on non-interference in internal affairs. Mao viewed it as India actively harboring a dangerous separatist. And worse, he suspected India, along with the CIA, was secretly arming and funding the Tibetan rebels.
The paranoia was absolute. And almost instantly, the diplomatic anger translates into physical violence on the disputed border. We see the first blood spilled.
Yes. In August 1959, an armed Chinese patrol actively pushes Indian troops back at a border post called Kinzamani. Shortly after, there is a brief but intense firefight at a place called Longju in the eastern sector.
But the incident that fundamentally changes the psychology of the Indian public happens in October 1959. It's known as the Karam Singh incident.
This takes us back to the western sector, to a desolate mountain pass near Aksai Chin called Konka La. On October 20th, a heavily armed Indian police patrol, led by a seasoned veteran named Havildar Karam Singh.
And just to clarify the terminology for our listeners, a Havildar in the Indian military structure is a non-commissioned officer rank, essentially equivalent to a sergeant.
Right.
It implies a highly experienced, hardened soldier who leads men on the ground.
Exactly. So Havildar Karam Singh and his men are out searching for 2 missing Indian policemen. Suddenly, they find themselves surrounded and ambushed by a much larger, entrenched Chinese military force.
Wow.
A fierce firefight breaks out. 9 Indian policemen are killed in the snow. 10, including Karam Singh, are taken prisoner and subjected to harsh interrogation for weeks before being released.
And the Chinese claimed the Indian police were the aggressors and had deeply intruded into Chinese territory, while the Indian government insists the patrol was well within the traditional Indian boundary and was victims of a premeditated massacre.
Right. And when the news of the dead policemen hits the Indian press, the country erupts. The era of brotherly relations is dead and buried.
Yeah, the Indian parliament is in an uproar. The press is screaming for retaliation. Prime Minister Nehru, who had staked his entire foreign policy legacy on peace with China, is suddenly being publicly accused of cowardice, of hiding the truth about the Aksai-Chin Road, and of failing to protect the nation's borders.
The political pressure to do something becomes suffocating. The public is demanding that the army be sent to the border to throw the Chinese out.
But here is where we hit the core tragedy of the situation. The Indian military commanders are looking at the maps, looking at their supply lines, and telling the politicians, we cannot do this.
Yeah.
Let's pause the timeline right here. The public is demanding action, the military is urging caution, and the politicians are caught in the middle. To understand why the military was so terrified of a conflict, we have to look at the two things that actually dictate the reality of war: the lines on the map and the shape of the earth. Let's talk about the maps first, because if you lay the Indian map and the Chinese map on top of each other, they don't even come close to matching.
No, the cartography is a total nightmare. And it stems from a fundamental clash of civilizational worldviews. We touched on this earlier with the concept of suzerainty, but we need to dive deeper. Post-colonial India inherited the European Westphalian concept of a nation-state.
The Westphalian concept, meaning what exactly in terms of borders?
It means that a nation's sovereignty is absolute, and it extends exactly to a defined, mathematically surveyed, fixed line on a map. A border is a rigid wall. You are either inside the country, subject to its laws, or you are outside.
Okay.
And to the Indian government, the lines drawn by the British surveyors in the 19th and early 20th centuries were the wholly unchangeable boundaries of the state.
A line is a line, but Imperial China didn't play by those rules.
No, they didn't. The Qing dynasty, and later Mao's communist state, viewed the world through the lens of a tributary system. The emperor sat at the center of civilization. Around the core Chinese provinces were rings of vassal states like Tibet or Korea or Vietnam.
Right.
These vassals managed themselves but owed allegiance and tribute to the center.
So in that worldview, a frontier isn't a razor-thin line drawn by a guy with a theodolite. It's a nebulous, breathing, fluid zone of influence that expands when the central empire is strong and contracts when the empire is weak.
Precisely. And Chairman Mao operated under a very specific, deeply ingrained historical mandate. We can call it an irredentist attitude.
Irredentism, meaning the political desire to reclaim and occupy territory that a nation believes was formerly lost to them in the past.
Exactly. Mao's philosophy was essentially, territory which was once Chinese must forever remain so, and if it was stolen by imperialist barbarians when China was weak, it must be forcefully recovered now that China is strong.
So you have a newly independent Indian democracy clinging to rigid colonial-era maps for its legal survival, facing off against a newly unified, heavily armed communist state intent on restoring the fluid imperial boundaries of its ancestors.
Yeah.
It's like two people sitting down to play a board game. One person thinks they're playing chess, where every square is strictly defined, and the other person thinks they're playing Go, where the goal is fluid territorial domination. And worse, they're using rule books from two completely different centuries.
That is the perfect analogy. And the friction points of this game were two very specific lines drawn by the British. Let's look at the western sector first, the Aksai-Chin problem.
We mentioned the Indian maps showed Aksai-Chin as their territory. Why?
Because of a man named William Henry Johnson. In 1865, Johnson was an officer with the Survey of India. He treks across the Aksai-Chin Plateau. At the time, the British were worried about the expanding Russian Empire to the north. Johnson decides that the natural, defensible boundary for the British isn't the towering Karakoram mountain range, which is further south, but rather the Kunlun Mountains, which are much further north.
So he just draws a line, the Johnson line, that scoops up the entirety of this desolate, freezing desert and says, this is now part of the princely state of Kashmir, which was under British protection.
Yes. He essentially pushed the border as far forward as he could justify to create a larger buffer against Russia. The problem was he never consulted the Chinese. The Chinese never agreed to it.
Wow.
In fact, even the British government later realized the Johnson Line was militarily indefensible because Aksai-Chin was so barren.
Right. The British actually changed their minds later on.
They did. In 1899, the British formally proposed a much more modest line to the Chinese government, the McCartney-MacDonald Line. This line essentially chopped Aksai-Chin in half, keeping the southern bit for Britain and explicitly leaving the northern bit, where the vital trade routes were, to China. Yeah, the British did this because they actually wanted China to occupy that space to act as a physical bloc against the Russians.
But the Chinese government, being weak and disorganized at the time, never formally responded to the proposal.
Exactly. So the treaty was never ratified. Fast forward to 1947, India becomes independent. They look at the archives, they see the Maximalist Johnson Line from 1865, and they adopt it as the official, non-negotiable border of the new Indian Republic.
Which means suddenly, the massive highway that China just secretly built is legally sitting inside sovereign Indian territory.
Yep.
That's the mess in the West. Now, what about the eastern sector? The area that is today Arunachal Pradesh, but back then was known as NAFA, the Northeast Frontier Agency.
In the east, the legal dispute centers entirely around the McMahon Line. In 1914, the British convened the Simla Convention. It was a tripartite conference involving Britain, the newly formed Republic of China, and representatives from Tibet.
The British Foreign Secretary in India, Sir Henry McMahon, sits down with the Tibetans and draws a thick red line on a map.
Right. And he bases this line on what is known as the watershed principle.
Okay, let's explain the watershed principle because it sounds highly technical, but it's actually incredibly intuitive. Imagine the roof of a house. When it rains, the water hits the peak of the roof. Half the water flows down the left side, half flows down the right side. That peak is the watershed line.
Right.
McMahon applied this to the Himalayas. He drew the border along the highest continuous ridge crests. Everything on the southern slope, where the rivers flow down into the Indian plains, belongs to India. Everything on the northern slope, flowing onto the Tibetan plateau, belongs to Tibet.
Geographically, it makes perfect logical sense. It is the most natural defensive barrier you could ask for. McMahon drew the line. The Tibetan delegates, acting as an independent nation, signed the treaty, formally placing the vast, jungle-covered NEFA region inside British India.
But the Chinese delegate at the convention refused to sign the final binding document.
Right. And here we return to the suzerainty argument. The Chinese government completely repudiated the McMahon Line. They argued that Tibet was merely a vassal state, a local province of China, and therefore, under international law, Tibet had absolutely no legal authority to sign treaties with foreign empires giving away territory.
So China essentially says the British tricked a local governor into giving away a massive chunk of southern Tibet, and we will never recognize it as valid.
So by 1960, you have a complete diplomatic deadlock. India says the Johnson Line and the McMahon Line are fixed, legal, and non-negotiable.
And China says those lines are illegal, imperialist fictions, and we are willing to negotiate a new border, but we will not be dictated to.
Exactly. The maps are irreconcilable. But as we said earlier, maps are flat. The real world is terrifyingly vertical. And this is where we have to talk about the topography.
Right, because the geography of the Himalayas didn't just complicate the politics. It dictated the entire military reality. If you don't understand the terrain, you cannot understand why the battles in 1962 were such a lopsided slaughter.
The terrain is arguably the most important and the most lethal character in this entire historical narrative. The Sino-Indian border runs for over 3,400 kilometers, largely along the jagged crests of the Himalayan and Karakoram mountain ranges.
Yeah.
It is an environment actively hostile to human existence, let alone mechanized warfare.
Let's break down the asymmetry here, because this blew my mind when digging through the sources. The two sides were not fighting on equal footing. Literally.
No, the topographical imbalance was staggering, and it heavily favored the Chinese military.
Yep.
If you look at the Chinese side of the border, the vast majority of their staging areas are located on the Tibetan Plateau.
The roof of the world.
Exactly. It sits at an immense altitude, roughly 14,000 to 15,000 feet. But critically, it is a plateau. It is relatively flat, it is expansive, and because it sits in the rain shadow of the Himalayas, it is arid. It is a dry, stony surface.
Why does that matter so much for an army?
Because a flat, stony, dry surface is a civil engineer's dream. It means you can build roads, it means you can lay down asphalt or compacted dirt rapidly, and the roads won't wash away in the rain.
Oh, wow.
The Chinese PLA leveraged this geographic gift masterfully. By 1962, they had constructed a sprawling, highly efficient network of military highways connecting their deep supply bases in Xinjiang and eastern China directly to the Tibetan border.
The sources mentioned that the Chinese had 7-ton motorable road heads pushed right up near the front lines.
That is a critical detail. A 7-ton roadhead means the road is wide enough, stable enough, and graded smoothly enough that a heavy, fully loaded 7-ton military logistics truck can drive right up to the staging area.
That's massive.
Yeah, the Chinese could transport thousands of fresh troops, heavy artillery pieces, massive stockpiles of mortar shells, and winter rations directly to the battlefield without breaking a sweat. Their supply chain was mechanized and robust.
Okay, now let's flip the perspective. You are an Indian soldier, you are stationed in the plains of Assam, you get the order to march to the border in Nepha, the eastern sector. What are you facing?
You are facing a vertical nightmare. The Indian side of the border does not have a gentle plateau. It is defined by the Greater Himalayas. You are looking at a sheer, jagged wall of rock rising from the humid plains up to peaks well over 20,000 feet.
Insane.
You have to navigate prominent, razor-sharp ridgelines like the Thagla Ridge and the immense, freezing Sela Massif.
And the valleys don't run parallel to the border, right? They run perpendicular.
Yes. The river valleys, carved by torrential rivers like the Namka Chu and the Tawang Chu, run north to south. This means any road you try to build has to constantly zigzag up and down sheer cliff faces. And unlike arid Tibet, the Indian slopes are battered by the monsoon.
Right.
They receive hundreds of inches of torrential rain.
Which means the valleys are covered in thick, primeval, impenetrable jungles, swarming with leeches and malaria.
And the rain turns the mountainsides into liquid. Any road the Indian Army tried to cut into the mountain would routinely be obliterated by massive landslides. Road construction was agonizingly slow and constantly being undone by nature.
Let's talk about what that actually meant for getting a box of bullets to the front line. Because the contrast with the Chinese 7-ton trucks is just absurd.
In the eastern sector, the main Indian arterial road only went as far as a town called Bombadilla. Beyond that, the roads degraded rapidly. They became what military engineers call a Class 5 road.
And a Class 5 road isn't really a road at all, is it?
No. It's essentially a widened dirt track. It is unpaved, deeply rutted, and prone to collapsing under heavy weight. It is suitable only for very light vehicles, maybe a jeep, but mostly it's used by mules and human porters.
Wow.
Eventually, as you push further north toward the McMahon Line, even the Class 5 roads vanish entirely. You are left with narrow, treacherous foot tracks winding along the edges of cliffs.
To put this logistical nightmare into perspective for our listener, imagine a war breaks out. The enemy is heavily armed and waiting. On the Chinese side, bringing a crate of ammunition to the front line means loading it onto a truck and driving it there in a few hours.
Yep.
On the Indian side, bringing that exact same crate of ammunition from the nearest stable roadhead meant strapping it to the back of a mule or a human porter and walking uphill in freezing rain through leech-infested jungles for up to 21 days.
A 21-day trek just to reach the battlefield. The caloric expenditure of the soldiers simply marching to the front was staggering. By the time an Indian unit arrived at their defensive position at 14,000 feet, they were exhausted, malnourished, and carrying only what they could physically strap to their backs.
That's horrifying.
They couldn't bring heavy artillery because you cannot carry a howitzer up a foot track.
And we haven't even talked about the altitude sickness yet.
Right, because the human body is not designed to operate above 10,000 feet without slow, phased acclimatization. At 14,000 feet, the oxygen levels are drastically lower. If you rush troops up from sea level too quickly, they suffer from acute mountain sickness.
Yeah.
Their lungs can fill with fluid, their brains swell, they become lethargic and physically incapable of fighting.
While the Chinese troops were already permanently garrisoned on the Tibetan plateau, their bodies were fully acclimatized.
Exactly.
The Indian troops, specifically the 4th Infantry Division, which we'll talk about shortly, were based in the sweltering plains of Punjab and Assam. When the crisis hit, they were rushed onto trains, driven to the foothills in order to march straight up into the freezing snows.
They were rushed up so quickly they were still wearing their cotton summer uniforms.
In the Himalayas.
Yes. Canvas shoes, light sweaters. They were facing temperatures dropping below minus 30 degrees Celsius at night. The Indian soldiers were literally freezing to death in their trenches before they even saw a Chinese soldier.
There's a profound military maxim that encapsulates this entire tragedy, right?
Right.
Mountains reward preparation, not presence.
That is the core takeaway.
Right.
Simply putting a flag on a mountaintop or rushing a terrified, freezing platoon to a ridgeline does not mean you control that territory. If you cannot logistically sustain those troops, if you cannot feed them, warm them, and supply them with ammunition faster than they expend it, then your presence is an illusion.
Right.
China spent a decade preparing the logistical battlefield. India, driven by political panic, merely showed up.
Which brings us to the most painful part of this deep dive. The decisions made in New Delhi between 1961 and 1962. We've established that the maps were a mess, the terrain was a death trap, and the Indian military was logistically incapable of fighting a high-altitude war.
Yeah.
The generals knew this. General Cariappa warned them in 1950. The field commanders warned them in 1960.
But the political leadership refused to listen. And this civil-military disconnect is what transforms a disadvantageous situation into a national catastrophe.
Let's talk about the forward policy of 1961. The public is furious over the Karam Singh ambush. The opposition parties in parliament are tearing Prime Minister Nehru apart for being weak on China.
Right.
Nehru and his defense minister, a man named V.K. Krishna Menon, decide they have to do something highly visible to prove they are defending the borders.
Krishna Menon is a fascinating and destructive figure in this narrative. He was a brilliant intellectual, deeply anti-imperialist, but he was incredibly arrogant and famously distrustful of his own professional military officers.
He didn't like them at all.
No, he believed the Sandhurst-trained Indian generals were overly cautious and lacked revolutionary zeal. He also firmly believed that the only real military threat to India was Pakistan, and that a communist brother state like China would never actually launch a full-scale war.
So based on this fundamental fatal assumption that China will bark but never actually bite, Menon and Nehru devised the forward policy. What exactly were the operational orders given to the army?
The order was to physically occupy the disputed territories by establishing dozens of small, isolated military posts in both the western sector of Aksai Chin and the eastern sector of Nifa. They were ordered to push these posts as far forward as possible, right up to the absolute limits of the Indian map claims.
And these weren't heavily fortified bunkers, right?
Far from it. The military calls this deploying in penny packets. You are taking your limited manpower and scattering them in tiny, militarily useless groups of 10, 20, or maybe 40 men.
That's nothing.
These outposts were essentially tents or shallow trenches pitched in the snow. Because of the horrific logistics we just discussed, these men had almost no ammunition, very little food, and they were entirely reliant on supply airdrops.
Which I assume didn't always hit the mark.
No, they usually missed their targets completely because of the violent Himalayan winds.
Furthermore, in an act of staggering tactical recklessness, some of these Indian posts were deliberately established behind existing Chinese forward positions. The theory was that this would threaten Chinese supply lines and force them to withdraw.
It was a policy of deliberate provocation without the means of protection. The professional military leadership was absolutely horrified. The Chief of Army Staff, General K.S. Tamaya, and the head of the Eastern Command, General S.P.P. Thorat, vehemently opposed the forward policy.
General Thorat actually wrote a brilliant, highly classified paper in 1959 explicitly warning the government about this exact scenario.
Yes, Thorat was a master of mountain warfare doctrine. He told the politicians, point blank, that the McMahon Line could not be defended by sitting on it. If you put troops on the very edge of the map at the end of a 21-day supply line, they will be cut off and destroyed.
So what was Thorat's alternative strategy? Because obviously you can't just let the enemy walk in.
Thorat advocated for trading space for time. It's a classic defensive strategy in impossible terrain. He argued that India should keep only light reconnaissance patrols on the high ridges. The main bulk of the Indian army should be held much further south, lower down the mountains, near reliable Indian roadheads and supply bases, like the town of Bumdila.
I want to make sure this makes sense to you listening. The logic is, if it takes me 3 weeks of agonizing trekking just to bring a box of bullets up the mountain to fight you, why would I do that?
Exactly.
Instead, I'll sit comfortably near my supply trucks at the bottom of the mountain, and I will force you, the enemy, to march 3 weeks away from your supply lines. Let the Chinese stretch their logistics to the breaking point, traversing the jungles, and then fight them at my front door, where I have the advantage.
It was militarily impeccable logic. It utilized the hostile terrain against the attacker, but to a politician under fire, trading space means giving up territory, even temporarily. It looks like retreat. It looks weak. So Krishna Menon completely rejected Thorat's defensive plan. When General Tamaya pushed back against the political interference, Menon marginalized him so severely that Tamaya actually resigned in protest.
A massive crisis. Nehru actually talks Tamaya into withdrawing his resignation, but then Nehru goes into parliament the very next day and publicly humiliates the general, dismissing his concerns as trivial.
And with the competent, independent-minded generals sidelined or silenced, Menon begins installing politically compliant officers into high commands. Men who will execute the forward policy without bringing up inconvenient facts like logistics or ammunition shortages. The prime example is Lieutenant General B.M. Call.
Call is a central, tragic figure here.
He was. Call had very little actual combat command experience, having spent much of his career in logistics and public relations. But he was deeply connected politically, a distant relative of Nehru and a favorite of Krishna Menon.
Of course.
Call was put in charge of a brand new formation, the IV Corps, and given the explicit mandate to execute the forward policy in the eastern sector, regardless of the physical realities.
And this deadly combination, arrogant politicians, a sideline professional officer corps, compliant political generals, and a scattered freezing army all violently collide in the summer and autumn of 1962. Which brings us to the climax of our deep dive, Operation Leghorn.
Right. In June 1962, executing the forward policy, Indian troops establish a tiny, isolated post called Dola Post. It is located near the Thagla Ridge, deep in the eastern sector. Crucially, the exact alignment of the McMahon Line in this specific valley is heavily disputed, even amongst Indian cartographers.
And the Chinese view the establishment of Dola Post as a brazen intrusion into their territory. They don't just send a diplomatic note this time. They immediately move overwhelming military forces to the high ground surrounding the post, trapping the Indian soldiers.
The news hits New Delhi. The political establishment holds an emergency meeting, and instead of recognizing the untenable tactical situation and withdrawing the trapped men, they double down.
They decide that the honor of the nation demands that the Chinese must be physically evicted from the Thagla Ridge.
They order the military to execute Operation Leghorn. The objective, march up the mountain and throw the PLA off the ridge. And who do they send to do this?
They order the 4th Infantry Division to carry out the attack. Let me pause you right there, because the madness of this specific detail cannot be overstated. The 4th Infantry Division was a legendary, highly decorated unit, but they were equipped, trained, and permanently stationed for fighting tank battles in the flat, hot plains of the Punjab. They were not mountain troops.
They had no high-altitude gear, no snow tents, no heavy winter coats. They were armed with bolt-action Lee-Enfield rifles from World War II, while the Chinese were carrying modern automatic weapons.
It's just devastating.
The Corps commander on the ground, General Umrao Singh, was an experienced, pragmatic officer. When he received the order for Operation Leghorn, he protested vehemently. He sent messages back to headquarters explicitly stating that evicting the heavily armed, entrenched Chinese forces from the high ground was suicidal without a massive, month-long logistical buildup.
And what was the response from New Delhi?
General Umrao Singh was relieved of his command. He was replaced by someone who would follow orders.
If we connect all these threads together, the geopolitics, the maps, the terrain, why was the political leadership in Delhi so incredibly insistent on pushing this offensive forward when every military indicator screamed disaster?
Because the entire premise of the forward policy in Operation Leghorn was built on a hallucination. Nehru and Menon had convinced themselves, through a bizarre echo chamber of their own rhetoric, that China simply would not fight.
Unbelievable.
They believed that if Indian troops marched forward aggressively and showed the flag, the Chinese would back down and withdraw to avoid an international incident with a leader as prominent as Nehru.
They treated a military deployment like a rhetorical debate. They viewed the frozen, starving soldiers at Dola Post as diplomatic tripwires, mere symbols of legal possession, rather than living human beings who would actually have to pull triggers and believe.
Exactly, and there is a fundamental rule in statecraft that India violated here. Political intention without military capability creates ultimate vulnerability.
Let's use an analogy to really hammer this home. The forward policy is like sitting down at a high-stakes poker table. You look at your hand and it's absolute garbage, a 2 and a 7. But you decide you are going to win through sheer intimidation.
Yeah.
So you push every single chip you have into the middle of the table on a pure, aggressive bluff. The fatal flaw in your plan is that you have completely forgotten that the opponent sitting across from you is heavily armed, they have endless reserves of cash, and crucially, they've already seen your cards.
Right.
They know exactly how weak your logistics are. They know you have nothing backing up your bet.
And we must look at the opponent across the table. Chairman Mao Zedong was not a man who backed down from a bluff. He saw the Indian forward policy exactly for what it was, an arrogant, poorly executed, nibbling policy encroaching on what he considered sovereign Chinese territory.
And Mao's context is vital here, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. He is weakened domestically by the starvation of the Great Leap Forward. He is watching India grant asylum to the Dalai Lama. He is watching India accept financial and military aid from both the United States and the Soviet Union, making India look like an active threat.
So Mao needed a decisive, unifying victory to crush internal dissent and to permanently secure China's southwestern frontier on his own terms.
Yes. He decides to call India's bluff. He authorizes a massive, punitive counterblow designed to, in his words, teach India a lesson.
And the timing of this counterblow is a masterstroke of geopolitical opportunism.
Absolutely. Mao waits for the perfect moment when the international community is completely paralyzed. October 1962 perfectly coincides with the climax of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Right.
The United States and the Soviet Union are staring down the barrel of global thermonuclear war over missiles in the Caribbean. The superpowers are entirely distracted. No one in Washington or Moscow has the bandwidth to intervene in a war in the Himalayas. India is completely, utterly alone.
So on the morning of October 20th, 1962, the Chinese called the bluff. What happens to those isolated, freezing Indian outposts?
It is a systemic collapse, a slaughter. The Chinese PLA launches a massive, highly coordinated, pre-planned offensive simultaneously across both the eastern and western sectors. The forward policy had violated every single foundational principle of war.
Let's list them. Concentration of force.
Zero. The Indian troops were scattered in isolated penny packets across hundreds of miles of mountainous terrain. They could not support each other. The Chinese massed overwhelming numbers at specific points of attack.
Secure lines of communication.
Non-existent. The Indian troops were relying on rotting log bridges, terrified mules, and erratic airdrops. When the fighting started, the Indian supply lines instantly evaporated.
Strategic intelligence.
A total failure. The Indian political leadership and the compliant generals had completely blinded themselves to reality. They had absolutely no idea that the Chinese had spent weeks secretly moving tens of thousands of heavily armed assault troops, mortar batteries, and logistics trains right up to the ridgelines overlooking the Indian positions.
So when the artillery barrage begins on October 20th, the Indian soldiers of the 7th Infantry Brigade, freezing in their summer cottons along the Namkachu River, suddenly find themselves outnumbered by as much as 5-1.
The outposts are overrun in a matter of hours. The brave men on the ground fought desperately, often to the last bullet. But the outcome was a mathematical certainty. The battles were lost before the first artillery shell was fired because the strategy, the intelligence, and the preparation had fundamentally failed.
The war had officially begun. The shockwave of this collapse would reverberate through the Indian psyche for generations. We've covered an immense amount of ground today, pulling apart the structural foundations of this conflict. Let's do a rapid recall of the chain of consequence to lock these concepts in for your exam prep.
Right. The chain begins with the loss of the buffer state. In 1950, China invades Tibet, instantly bringing a massive battle-hardened communist army right to India's vulnerable northern doorstep. India, knowing it cannot fight, pursues the illusion of peace through the Panchsheel Agreement.
While India sleeps, China builds. The discovery of the secret Aksai Chin Road in 1957 shatters the illusion. The clash of civilizational worldviews, India's rigid colonial-era maps versus China's fluid imperial irredentism, creates an impossible diplomatic deadlock, severely worsened by India granting asylum to the fleeing Dalai Lama in 1959.
And with diplomacy dead, geography takes over. The staggering logistical asymmetry of the Himalayas dictates the reality of force. The flat, arid Tibetan plateau allows China to effortlessly sustain a massive army. The sheer jungle-choked monsoon-drenched slopes of the Indian side make supplying troops nearly impossible. Mountains reward preparation, not presence.
Yet, driven by public outrage and political arrogance, the civilian leadership forces the military to ignore the terrain. The disastrous forward policy of 1961 scatters unsupplied, freezing troops into isolated outposts based on the fatal assumption that China will not fight. And finally, in October 1962, seizing a moment of global distraction, China launches a devastating offensive, crushing the vulnerable Indian forces and exposing the hollow core of India's strategic posture.
Before we wrap up, I want to leave you with a provocative thought to mull over. We spent a lot of time today discussing how the British Empire, drawing lines like the McMahon and Johnson lines to protect their own imperial interests, laid the groundwork for this entire conflict. It raises a difficult question about the legacy of colonialism. If borders are drawn by distant empires on a map, often without the deep consent or understanding of the local powers, does the departure of that empire make a future war geographically inevitable? The map itself becomes a ticking time bomb. But on the other hand, looking at the arrogant miscalculations of Nehru and the aggressive opportunism of Mao, is conflict always, ultimately, a choice made by modern leaders, regardless of the flawed maps they inherited?
That is a phenomenal question. Are we prisoners of the map or prisoners of our own assumptions?
Mm.
We started this deep dive talking about the expectation of precision when looking at a border drawn on paper. We've seen today that in the high Himalayas, those lines on the map weren't just ink.
No.
They were deep geopolitical fault lines. And the pressure of competing empires, impossible terrain, and political delusion had been building against them for decades until they finally, violently snapped.
And the tragedy is that when those fault lines finally snapped, it was the unprepared soldiers shivering in the snow who paid the ultimate price for the structural failures engineered at the very top.
Here are the top 10 keywords from Module 1 for you to recall. Panchsheel, Buffer State, Johnson Line, McMahon Line, Aksai Chin, NEFA, Watershed Principle, 1959 Uprising, Forward Policy, and Operation Leghorn. After understanding why the conflict occurred, the next module analysis, Force Preparedness, Forward Policy Execution, Operation Leghorn, and the beginning of battlefield operations.